Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Woodburn Accountants and Advisors China webinar series on human resource compliance in China. You have joined us today for part 4, where we'll be talking about social insurance obligations. This has been a 4-day webinar series where initially we were looking at questions such as, can you hire in China without a legal presence? What are the critical labor and employment law questions for you to know? Is it difficult to terminate employees in China? How does fraud occur amongst employees? Are you aware of the visa requirements for foreigners, as well as with the individual income tax regulations? And to just finish off with all of those various topics, today we are going to be talking specifically about social insurance obligations. The aim of Woodburn Accountants and Advisors after these 4 days is really to be able to provide companies and entrepreneurs with an overview of what is needed to know when thinking about human resource compliance. And hopefully you have all been able to receive enough information and enough knowledge to understand what your next steps would be in making sure that you remain compliant when thinking about HR issues in China. So welcome to part 4 of the webinar series, where again, we'll be looking at social insurance obligations in China. So to start off, who is this webinar for? Again, I always see new faces coming on, or new names, sorry, coming on to these webinars. So I just want to briefly introduce, who are these webinars aimed for? I've categorized them into 3 different types of groups. One are the newbies to China, so it's individuals that are either hired by companies or they themselves are entrepreneurs looking to understand an opportunity that they've either received or they found regarding China. So it's all about building that knowledge level now to understand how to basically take that opportunity and make it a real advantage and success in the Chinese market, but making sure you're also protected from your brand, you yourself as an entrepreneur, etc. For startups in China, these are generally companies that have been established for 1 to 3 years. Focus has always been placed on the core business, and as such, compliance issues, administrative issues have probably been on the back burner. And now when you hit a certain period of time, you're realizing, okay, situations are arising that we've got to place more focus on. So really that is something that this webinar series in particular is for that category of individuals. I still always get experienced China hands that pop along onto these webinar series. Experienced China hands are usually individuals that have been in China for 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. But as you know, regulations and rules are consistently changing, and particularly regarding social insurance, there were updates that were implemented last year. So it's always a way for them to get new and fresh ideas on how things work or things that they need to consider from a practical perspective. So again, these webinars, the best part of these webinars is really the Q&A at the end. There can only be a Q&A if you guys interact with me. So if you've got questions, if you've got comments, please, please, please interact with me. Add them into the chat section or question section of the control panel. How this webinar works is that it's going to last for about 60 minutes. Again, only if there is fruitful Q&A. I usually educate and teach, so there's a lot of information that I'm going to be spitting out. Grab yourselves a pen and paper if you want to take notes. There is a recording being made right now of this presentation, and a copy of the presentation will be sent out to all registrants and attendees as well. But please, this is 60 minutes of your time, so make use of it. I hope it'll be a valuable spend. Just some technical details. You have the GoToWebinar platform system that you are on right now. If you are in jurisdictions that are a bit sensitive to information, like China and the Middle East, you might find that the quality is not so great. So you have an option in the audio section to either switch between a computer audio or a landline. The landline is much greater stability and clarity than the computer audio, especially if you're in those sensitive jurisdictions. You are all muted. Obviously, this is in order for me to have no distractions or background noise and to have a clear recording that will then be uploaded to our YouTube channel. But if you want to have a valuable spend of your time, then shut your phones off, grab yourselves a pen and paper, take notes, and interact with me. Like I said, the best part of these webinar sessions are the Q&A sessions, and they're only great if you have questions that you can raise and speak to me about. So what are we covering today? We're going to be talking about social insurance reform as of 1st of Jan 2019. We're going to be talking about social insurance and housing fund. What does it actually mean? What does it entail? We're going back to the basics on that. And last but not least, I'm going to be talking about what's happening with social insurance right now under the coronavirus. So how can I help you? Well, my name is Kristina Kohler-Kalucha. I'm the head of business advisory at Woodburn Accountants and Advisors. This is just very simply to put a face to the voice. I wish we could use the camera system, but that always weakens the quality of the session. How can I help you? Well, basically, why I'm here today is I've got 16 years of corporate services and compliance experience in China. I've helped over 500 companies with their market entry, strategy, with their implementation, as well as their growth in China. And lately, obviously, also looking at their expansion outside of China into the Asian region. I'm also a creator of the China Roadmap program, which is part of our mentorship program, which is helping entrepreneurs and companies get China ready. I'll be touching a little bit on the Roadmap program at the end, just 1 or 2 slides to give you guys a bit of an introduction on that. If you enjoy our webinars, if you enjoy getting spammed 3 times a week, I'm just joking, but if you enjoy getting updates about China, about information related to China, everything from the basics that you need to know to a little bit more of the complicated stuff, then subscribe free of charge. We send out our mailings Monday, Wednesday, Fridays with past recordings, with articles and publications, with upcoming events, with questions that are just directed at you so that I get a better understanding of your background and who you are. So if you are interested in interacting with us, please do subscribe on our website. You just have to insert your email address. Other than that, you can follow me on LinkedIn. Lately, I've been very, very busy just updating my connections with updates about the coronavirus and what's happening. So more than pleased to add you as one of my contacts, or you can follow Woodburn's page as well on LinkedIn. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel, which has all recordings that we've ever made uploaded up there, and you can always look back on certain recordings or get updates on upcoming recordings. So why should you be concerned by social insurance in China? And I just want to emphasize here that probably out of the 4 sessions this week, from my perspective, this is the most important. Why is it the most important? One, because companies don't include social insurance into their budget line items because they're not educated enough to know that social insurance is applicable to everyone. Companies do not conduct HR audits to check that social insurance is being properly calculated and paid. And for those companies that tend to use intermediaries to hire individuals, they don't even do their own background checks to check that the intermediaries are either paying the social insurance or declaring the social insurance at all. And I just want to highlight a couple of case studies here. So you obviously violate the law if you don't pay any social insurance at all. But the violations by foreign employers in China are I most commonly see as more subtle and complicated than that. We see violations when employers fail to pay social insurance for the entire term of employment. That's purely just ignorance. This violation often happens when the employer thinks it need not pay the social insurance during an employee's probation period. Then they forget and they never pay it and declare it. We also see violations involving employers failing to pay all 5 types of social insurance. And there are 5 different types of social insurances. And with raising or rising wages, so every year you generally give some form of an increase, we have lately been seeing employers keeping the social insurance at the lower salary, the previous salary rate, versus actually increasing the social insurance based on the new salary that is being provided to the employee. We also have employers who discreetly declare a lower salary of the employees in order to incur less social insurance than what is actually declared as the salary. Now, employees may consent to the employer claiming a lower salary, but quite frankly, from a legal perspective, it is absolutely irrelevant. Okay, once caught or once someone has denounced you, it doesn't matter whom has consented. The issue will be that you have to go to court. So just to reiterate, what is becoming a fairly regular theme whenever I'm talking about HR issues or employment issues is that written consent does not change anything when it comes to social insurance. You've got to make sure that you are declaring the right social insurance rates for the right salary that is being provided to every employee. Now, as you can probably imagine, foreign companies have always been under the microscope in regards to this, more so than domestic companies. Now, under the new foreign investment law, that should change because it should be a fair playing field amongst foreign ownership companies versus domestic ownership companies, but it doesn't matter, okay? The government is always going to seek people or seek companies that are non-compliant, and you have just got to make sure that in regards to the social insurance aspects, everything is above board. So let's get started a little bit on the social insurance reform of Jan 1. Now, this may be a little bit difficult to understand without knowing the basics of social insurance, but I kind of wanted to start off with this today because it will give you a little bit of an introduction. So the biggest change that occurred in Jan 1, 2019 for specifically corporate service providers, but obviously also for companies, is the fact that social insurance contributions are going to be levied by tax bureaus now versus social insurance bureaus. Now, in the past, you would have certain jurisdictions or certain cities and villages and towns and whatnot that had the tax bureau always levying the social insurance amounts. However, they never took on the responsibility to check the social insurance fund. They never checked whether it was the right calculations. So as of Jan 1, in all of China, the tax bureau will have much more responsibility. First of all, they will be levying the social insurance amounts. And they will be checking that the social insurance contributions are correctly calculated based on the salary amounts that are being issued. So this has been implemented. This has occurred in all of 2019. Maybe some of you haven't actually noticed this within your organizations as to who is levying it, but just be prepared that the tax bureaus are now doing thorough checks on this. There were also other adjustments that occurred with the reform. To give you an example, there was a countrywide reduction in enterprise contributions to Urban Workers Pension Fund. There were progressive cuts for the premium rates for unemployment and work-related injury insurances. There was adjustments in the Social Security contribution bases. Again, a lot of this might be flying over your head, so there will be explanations that come a little bit later on. There was a unification of the basic aged care insurance payments. There was an increase in the pension fund adjustment. There was a broader application of the new Social Security payment collection system, establishment of a cooperation mechanism between the State Council as well as the relevant departments at the county levels. So these were all the changes, and just to give you a reference, these are a lot of changes that occurred. It was one of the first few reforms that had occurred for social insurance in quite a long time. I think the previous one was in 2011. So it was a good period to get all of these adjustments made last year, and all of them have actually been implemented. So let's go to the basics. Now, I've taken this diagram from HR1 because I think it really portrays very clearly what all of the insurances are. Now, just for your reference, you will see 6 items here. Under social insurance, you have pension, work injury, medical, maternity, and unemployment. And then separately, you have the housing fund. All 6 need to be paid. Okay, so that's why HR1 has actually grouped everything together. And in my mind, this is a perfect diagram because it should actually be all grouped together. Now, here you also have an understanding of who pays what. So generally speaking, when you're looking at social insurance in China, you will have a portion of the social insurance paid by the employee, and you will have a portion of the social insurance paid by the employer. You will see here that there are 2 items where the employee does not contribute, and that's the work injury insurance and the maternity insurance. All right. Now, what you need to understand in regards to the social insurance is that, number one, if you don't pay it, it is illegal. Number 2, it is generally split by the employee, by the employer. However, that's not mandatory. You will have some employers that contribute the full amount, where the employee then doesn't contribute at all. You have the Social Insurance Bureau that gets the funds for the 5: pension, work injury, medical, maternity, unemployment, and then the housing is actually provided to the Housing Fund Bureau. Now, what's important about the calculations associated with all 6 items is that the base salary is different from city to city. It also changes, so there are fluctuations, and the percentage rates to allocate the insurances also vary depending city to city, and also change year on year. So it is something that you have to make sure you are on top of and are aware of every year, because the third component that also changes usually is the employee salary. So you always have to make sure that there are the proper amendments made based on the employee salary, based on the new social insurance rates, and based on the new base salary. Now, I want to go through all the various items and give you an explanation of what they mean. So the first is pension. An individual can receive a pension based on the amount accumulated in his or her individual fund after retirement. In general, individuals need to pay at least 15 years of contributions prior to receiving a pension in China. Some industries have different retirement ages, but mainly men are 55 years old, women are 50 years old for blue-collar workers, and men are 60 years old and women are 55 years old for white-collar workers. The amount of retirement benefits depends on the local regulations. As I mentioned, the rates vary city to city. And due to China's population problems, these ages, again, may soon change as well. But currently, those are the ages for retirement. The next one is medical insurance. So in the event of illness or non-occupational injury, an employee can have part of the treatment costs covered by the medical insurance. The medical insurance in China is required to be paid by both the employer as well as the employee on a monthly basis. The medical insurance fund will reimburse medical expenses to designated hospitals for treatment. One big emphasis here, international clinics are excluded from the type of hospitals or clinics that can be covered under this type of medical insurance. For unemployment insurance, this is in the event of redundancy, where the employee may claim unemployment benefits for a maximum period of 24 months. Employers must contribute to the unemployment insurance fund. However, only employees in certain jurisdictions are required to also contribute. But generally speaking, if you're looking at all the tier 1 cities, they will contribute. Under normal circumstances, unemployed persons have the right to receive unemployment benefits for up to 12 to 24 months, depending on the actual situation, if they make more than 12 months of donations. So you've got to be aware of the quantity there. Work-related injury insurance. So the work-related injury fund in China covers the cost of treatment should an occupational injury or illness occur during working hours. In addition, employees working under certain weather conditions will also receive allowances. Only employers are required to pay work-related injury insurance monthly. In some jurisdictions, the monthly amount required will vary according to the industry that you're in. Insurance usually includes all work injuries and occupational diseases. The work injury insurance fund will pay for the treatment. Employers still need to pay part of their wages to individuals, but their wages will be less than the full wages. Even if the employer does not make the necessary contribution, the individual can still apply for treatment and pay through the insurance fund. And the fund manager will actually then be required to track the employer for full compensation. And here I want to give a very big case study. I had a client out of Germany that was using an intermediary. Actually, they were using one of their suppliers to hire individuals, mainland Chinese individuals on the ground in China. And they were working from the office of the supplier as well, or they're working out of the office of the supplier. Basically, the terms and conditions of the agreement was that the supplier would issue an invoice with salary amounts to the German entity, and the German entity would then pay, and then the supplier would actually fund everything through those fees. Now, the German company, what happened in the end was that they did not build their knowledge level on what actually needs to be paid to each employee. They just placed trust and faith that the supplier was going to do everything above board, okay? One of the employees of the German company goes on a business trip to China, sees that one of his staff is on crutches, and during the lunch period, there's an envelope that is being distributed amongst all of the employees with cash being put inside. And so he raises the question to one of his senior team members and says, you know, what's this envelope for? And the team member says, well, actually, XYZ had an accident on site, but the company isn't providing any form of insurance, so he's paying for the medical bills all on his own, and the team members are all contributing to help him to pay for it. Now, this started, you know, because for him in Germany, everything is covered. So for him, he was like, this is weird. I can't imagine in China that there's no form of insurance to cover these types of situations. So he started asking questions. The discovery basically led to the fact that the supplier was not declaring any form of social insurance for the team members associated with the German company. And he was basically pocketing the funds that were being sent over. He was paying salaries, but he wasn't paying anything in terms of social insurance. Now, obviously, in the end of the day, this situation had to be fixed. All past social insurance obligations had to be paid. Penalties were then declared. And obviously the relationship between the supplier and the German company, you know, there was a lack of trust there, right? Which had to be rebuilt, etc. But this poor guy had no social insurance, had no insurance at all to pay for his medical bills, and he had a broken leg. Okay, he was on crutches. So, you know, just imagine you have employees. I mean, where is the humanity in all of this, right? Now, I'm going to blame both parties here. I blame the supplier for obviously being sneaky, but I also blame the German party for not educating themselves on knowing and understanding how important it is to know what are the components associated with someone's salary package. Everything from base salary all the way to social insurance obligations, all the way to individual income tax obligations. So it's very important to make sure you understand all of this. And I relate it to this item here because there was no work-related injury insurance given to those employees. Okay, then you've got the maternity insurance, and now comes the biggest, I guess, contradiction, is that you would assume that maternity insurance would only be given to women. In fact, it's given to everybody. I mean, at least in Shanghai, it's given to both men and women. And basically, during the the whole point of the maternity insurance is that during maternity leave, the employee receives reimbursement from the insurance for all medical bills associated with giving birth and having a baby. So, keep that in mind in terms of maternity insurance. Now, you have, insurance companies out there, and HR1 is one of them, but I just want to add here, you have a bunch of different insurance companies out there on the market that can also provide supplemental insurances to, again, increase the amount of money that your team members will receive. None of this is mandatory. This is actually additional compensations that are being provided. So one of them is a commercial or supplemental health insurance, and the other one is also an add-on for the supplemental housing fund. So this is something also, again, to keep in mind when thinking about social insurance and understanding, do you want to give more or don't you want to give more? Other items that are also being offered by insurance companies are things like a mandatory annual health check. Now, this is something that I do offer to my team. I want them to get an annual health check, which includes getting x-rays, blood tests, and doing a full body check. I think this is just a nice added value for each of the team members. You've got to imagine that for the majority of the mainland Chinese people, this will be the only insurance that they have. They won't purchase for themselves, or very rarely will they purchase for themselves additional insurances. So it's only an attractive benefit if the company provides certain add-ons that are not mandatory to attract individuals to work with them. So keep that in mind. Now, in terms of the housing fund, this is not part of the social insurance, but it is also something that is mandatory to be provided. Housing fund is actually a fund that goes into allowing individuals to purchase apartments or houses. You can also have the supplemental housing fund, which then just increases the amount of money they get into these reserve funds. And basically what it means is that if you have a team member who is looking to purchase a house, they can obtain these funds to help pay for the down payment of the apartment or of the house. So ultimately, let's look at employer obligations, okay? Both the employer and the employee are obligated to make contributions. Sometimes you will find that the employers make the full contribution into the funds. You have to make sure that the calculations are correct and that the payments are made. You also have to make sure that the payments are made timely. So generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, when you make the payment for the net salary into the employee's account, you will also make the payment into the social insurance fund as well as the housing fund, and you will then use the opportunity as well to declare the individual income tax. Generally speaking, the timeframes are as follows. Usually you will have the last day of the month where the net salary is paid. Most of the time, the social insurance and housing fund and the individual income tax is paid between the 1st and the 8th of the following month. But you will have the payments already set up in your banking systems, okay? In case of severe and multiple violations, you will find that your company will be blacklisted. You may also find that the tax bureau, because when you set up companies nowadays and you open your bank accounts, you will usually have the bank requesting that a tripartite agreement is signed between the tax bureau, the bank, and your company, meaning that if you have not paid timely or you have not paid correct amounts, the tax bureau has every right to contact the bank to freeze your accounts until the payments are rectified. Okay, so every right for the tax bureaus to do that because they are the ones that are receiving the funds now. So one thing to be noted is that obviously, employer's obligation is to make adequate and timely contributions. You cannot be alleviated or exempted by reaching a mutual agreement with employees. You just simply, you've got to follow the law. And you've got to make sure really that the right amounts are paid, okay? The calculation of the social insurance is complicated, and I've tried my best to simplify it here. But just so you know, one of the things that we do offer for people is that if you send over a gross salary amount, we can provide, and the city and the hukou of the individual, then we can provide you with the breakdown because it is quite complicated to calculate. But basically, the Social Security contribution base is a figure that is determined by the employee's average income in the previous year. If the employee is a new hire, then the starting salary is utilized at the Social Security base. And then every year thereafter, it changes. The base figures for the Social Security contributions has a floor as well as a ceiling. Generally, the contribution base is capped at 300% of the average local salary, and the minimum contribution base is usually decided either by the local minimum wage or percentage of the average local wage of that jurisdiction, that city. As mentioned earlier, updates of the average local salary benchmark and minimum wage occur once per year, and they occur in different months of the year, so it's never unified. So again, it's very important for your HR department or your outsourced provider to give you that information so you're updated in terms of creating your own budgets, okay? You've got to be up to date on the information. What's the impact of the social insurance on foreigners? Now, I've added this slide in because the fact is that as of 2011, the Ministry of Human Resources and Social Security, they issued a release that all foreigners are required to be part of the social insurance scheme. And I'm not sure if you've all heard this, but within the month of February, there was also a release that in Hong Kong now, as well as in Macau, Chinese social insurance may be applied. Okay. Now I don't have more details about the Hong Kong and Macau portion because this just came out in February. And I didn't add a slide on it here because there is not that much information that's been released, but it is a very new update that's occurred in 2020. In terms of foreigners, it is very complicated because there are major inconsistencies based on where the foreigner resides. So I've put a couple of examples here: Beijing, Shenzhen, Tianjin, Nanjing, Xi'an, all those cities, you are required to pay social insurance. It's compulsory. There have been in the past, even in Beijing, Channing district, for example, didn't allow you to pay social insurance as a foreigner, but all of the other districts did. So, very complicated. Shanghai does not currently require foreign employees to contribute towards social insurance. There's always been a rumor since basically 2011 saying that at some point it's going to come into fruition, and that the biggest rumor out there is that you're going to have to backdate all the way to 2011, which I don't know how people are going to do, because since 2011 foreigners have come and gone. So my prediction is that if it ever does come into fruition in Shanghai, it'll just be for people that are based there, that are currently based there. You also have Dalian that only requires you to pay pension and medical insurance. So you've really got to check wherever that foreigner is residing, do they have to pay or don't they have to pay? Because it is part of the full compensation package that you need to consider for the foreigner. Now, on top of all of this, you also have 12 countries that have reached agreements with China, and 10 of which have been implemented, whereby if you are a foreigner that has a passport from that jurisdiction, you don't have to, or you are exempted from the social insurance. So the countries very quickly are Germany, South Korea, Denmark, Canada, Finland, Switzerland, Netherlands, Spain, Luxembourg, and Japan. China has signed with France and Serbia, but they haven't come into effect yet. So the biggest issue here is really, if you come from those jurisdictions, you need to have an open dialogue with the Human Resource Bureau in order to understand, with the agreement signed with your country, what are you exempted from? Which of the 5 social insurance items do you not have to pay, and do you have to pay? Every agreement is different, which is why, again, I've not added anything in here regarding those agreements. It's so case specific. Now, my next slide is about whether it's a burden for employers in China. I'm just going to go back. In terms of foreigners, it is considered a real burden, primarily because foreigners in China will want to go to an international clinic. Okay, and that will be primarily because of the language capabilities. So under the social insurance premiums, for example, medical insurance, you cannot go to an international clinic. The insurance is only applicable to state-owned or local hospitals and clinics. So with foreigners, you always have to calculate in the package an additional insurance that covers them while they're in China. If you also have a foreigner that travels tremendously, you will want to have perhaps a global insurance for them in case anything happens while they are on their traveling trips. An additional burden for the foreigners is, how do they get the pension when they leave, right? So in theory, as I mentioned earlier, you're supposed to contribute for no less than 15 years into the pension fund. Now, if you have been living in China and you are now, and you have proof that you are now relocating to somewhere else, you can go to the Human Resource Bureau and ask for the pension to be provided to you. So definitely think about that. Just to give you an example, if a foreigner is earning, let's say, 15,000 renminbi per month, they've been on assignment for 3 years, they could, in theory, get 43,000 renminbi back, plus interest. So something to think about, because 43,000 on a 15,000 salary base is not peanuts. Now, obviously, if you're earning more than that, the amount will be higher. So then comes the question from the company, who gets that money back? The foreign individual or the company? That's an internal discussion that's to be had between the various people. But definitely think about, talking and having that open dialogue with the Human Resource Bureau once you have foreigners that are ending their assignments in China. So is social insurance a burden for employers in China? I think from a foreign employee perspective, absolutely. I think it is a burden, unless the foreigner speaks fluent Chinese and they are absolutely prepared to take themselves to a local hospital. I mean, even with my Chinese level, I can't go to a local hospital. I don't have the medical vocabulary in Chinese to explain what I would have. So my comfort is purely to go to an international clinic, and I'm sure with most foreigners it would be the same. So from a foreigner perspective, it's, the fact that you have to pay the social insurance plus get an additional insurance, it just all adds up. But again, in places like Shanghai, you don't. So it really comes down to where the individual is residing, also where the individual is from, to see whether there's an agreement in place where they get exempted. When you're talking about social insurance for mainland Chinese employees, I don't think it's a burden at all. And I think my previous case study really highlighted that, okay? Yes, it is an additional cost to the individual, to the company, but it provides your employees with some form of insurance that they are protected, okay? It also helps you to recruit talent, particularly if you are providing them with add-ons to the general, the base social insurance items. It also protects your business from any risks. So, if there is a work injury insurance, it's covered by the insurance. You don't have to pay any additional costs. Nothing will come out of your pocket, unless, of course, the employee sues you. That's a whole nother separate issue. Don't also forget that the employer's mandatory social insurance payments can be treated as salary expense and can be deducted from corporate income tax as well. So these are all not negative points when it's related to mainland Chinese staff. And I just want to highlight, for those of you that are foreigners that are not living in China, I think your expectation from your own company, wherever you're residing, whether it's in the US, whether it's in Europe, jurisdiction in Europe, your expectation is that the company also provides you with some form of insurance. So if you have that expectation in your home and jurisdiction, you should have it automatically in your expectation. That's something you need to consider for your employees in China. So I want to talk a little bit about tips for employers regarding social insurance in China. The first tip is really being very careful with the calculations, okay? Because tax bureaus will be able to spot short payments. You've got to know what social insurance contributions are owed for every single employee that you have. You've got to make sure those calculations are updated. If there are salary increases, you also have to make sure that those calculations are updated if there are the annual changes to the rates. All right. You also have to think about the social insurance contributions for dispatched employees or low-cost workers. There has to be a review that is done by the company to see whether those are being offered. For example, if you've got part-time employees, part-time employees don't have to sign employment contracts. They don't have to be part of the social insurance contributions, but maybe it is something that you want to be able to offer them. So think about that. You need to be able to register and pay the social insurance for the employees in the city where the company is registered. So you need to know where, the city, your company is located. Look at the regulations in that city. One item I didn't discuss was whether your employees have a hukou in that city or not. A hukou basically means a resident permit. So this is really only associated with mainland Chinese individuals. So for example, you may have a team member who is residing in Shanghai, but is originally from Nanjing. Now, the big question is that every family or grown-up individual who's single will have what's called a family book. And in that family book, it will be registered where they are a resident. And it's called a hukou. And it's important to know where their hukous are based, because you will also have differential rates for non-hukou and hukou residents, which again makes it a little bit more complicated. As I mentioned, the tax bureau can affect business as usual if social insurance payments are not done on time and in full. What this basically means is that the tax bureaus can stop you, can stop your bank account or freeze your bank account if they're not done, or if they're not done in time. You don't want to have your accounts frozen, okay? It will completely halt your business. And then most importantly, you have to be prepared that if you're non-compliant, that there will be penalties, either for non-payment, underpayment, and they will be more severe. So it is a case by case. I haven't put a minimum penalty amount here because it really will depend on your situation and how much it would be, and most importantly, for how long you have done it. Okay. So let's also look at a little bit at the current social insurance policies during the coronavirus. These have just come into fruition end of last week, early this week. And I think the first one is probably the most important. For any SME, social insurance payments will be exempt from the period of February to June 2020. And this is just to help people with their cash flow. And this is primarily for the pension, unemployment, and work-related injury contributions. For larger companies, it's February until April. Once June is bypassed, I think the government is really hoping that the country will be stabilized, and then in July, payments will have to be made once again. If you have a company in Hubei province, you will be also exempt from payment of social insurance contributions from the period of February to June 2020. Employers could apply to defer the payment of the housing fund contribution before the end of June without incurring any late penalties. So that is also being offered. To companies to do. The biggest thing probably I think that the government is worried about, and definitely I had certain questions that arose from attendees on Monday about laying staff off or reducing the workforce or turning people from full-time to part-time because of the business slump. Now, what the government is saying is that if you do not lay off people, if you don't reduce the workforce, then you can also get a refund of 50% of the actual amount of the unemployment insurance contributions that were paid in 2019. So keep that in mind. If you're a very large organization, that might be a hefty amount of money that you could get as a refund, only if you don't lay off and you don't reduce the workforce. There's also going to be a reduction of the contribution rate for medical insurance. So in Shanghai, they've reduced it by 0.5%. And the yearly adjustment will be postponed. So it is usually around April. It really comes down to the city. But if it is in April, it will now be in July. If it was in July, it will now be in October. So keep that in mind in terms of postponements of a lot of things. To finish up today's presentation, here are 8 ways that I can work with you to initiate your individual income tax obligations and also your social insurance obligations. One is in relation to employment advisory, drafting employment agreements and handbooks, doing due diligences on employees and companies. Incubation service is a service we offer as an intermediary, where the individual would be employed by us, making sure that all of the contributions related to social insurance, income tax, net salary are paid properly and legally. We also do work permit and residence visa applications, individual income tax calculations, payroll services, and we also do housing fund and social insurance applications on behalf of companies. So if any of this resonates to you and you want to have a personal discussion about your current situation or your company's current situation, don't hesitate to reach out and book a session with me. In the chat section, I'm just going to put the link that if you want to set up a meeting time, you can. You can also send me an email to Kristina@woodbourneglobal.com. But this is probably the easiest as it goes straight into my diary. Now let's look at whether there I forgot. Let me talk a little bit about the China roadmap. So, I've highlighted a couple of case studies during today's webinar session, predominantly about the foreign companies either trying to cheat the system or not being knowledgeable about the system. The whole point of developing this China roadmap was to help companies and entrepreneurs avoid not knowing things, right? And probably the biggest issue, or at least a good portion of budget spend for most companies in their startup phases is in relation to fixing things that they didn't know about. Or if they're proactively cheating the system, fixing things in terms of penalties because they cheated the system and they thought they could get away with it. The point of the China roadmap is to help basically newbies and startups with following 3 milestones, 9 different tasks on educating yourself and knowing what bullet points you have to be aware of to make sure that you are protected, that your company is protected, that your operation guidelines are secure, and everything has been thought out. So it's kind of giving bullet points in relation to it. We offer the China Roadmap as a mentorship program as well, and it goes through basically the 3 milestones of opportunity, implementation, and growth. If this resonates with anyone or someone would like to know more information about the China Roadmap program, please do get in touch. I'm happy to discuss it with you as well. But probably the biggest outcome you've discovered regarding today's presentation is that education and research are critical and are fundamental in knowing about how to do business in China. And so I always say that knowledge is power, and knowledge is what will protect you and your business. So keep that in mind. I also help, the China Roadmap program also applies to people that are the China experienced hands that maybe have to go back a few steps to fix things, but it gives you at least an idea of what you need to know and understand. So let's move on to the Q&A. Let me see some questions that have come in. Okay, so Lily, thank you very much for contributing a question. I think it is a great question that you have raised, and I want to touch on it. So Lily has basically a company in China that they don't have their own in-house HR department, and they are currently using an intermediary, I guess, payroll agent. She just wrote intermediary agent, but I assume, Lily, you're talking about intermediary payroll agent, where they are handling salary and welfare payments. And Lily comes to the question of, when we started the company, we were told that as a foreign company, we can't pay salary to our staff and pay social welfare to the bureaus by ourselves, and that we have to use an intermediary agent. So Lily, my biggest question to you would be, are you a representative office or are you a limited company in China? The reason I ask that is because a representative office is required to utilize an intermediary agent. So like FESCO, like Zhongzhi, like CIIC, there's a whole bunch of different payroll agents that are out there that you can utilize that act as an intermediary. And this is because a representative office cannot employ mainland Chinese staff directly. They can only hire foreign staff directly. So in that regard, you do have to use an intermediary. But Lily, if you are a limited company, there is nothing stopping you from building your own in-house HR department and doing all of these functions yourself. So for example, you can have the social insurance as well as the housing fund accounts under your own limited company. You can make all of the calculations yourself. You can pay the net salaries directly to your employees. You can pay the social insurance and housing fund amounts as a lump sum amount for your entire team directly into those accounts. You don't have to use any HR agent. Lily's mentioning here that they're using FESCO. So you can build your own in-house team. Now, I will just say for startups, I highly recommend you to use an intermediary as you get familiar with the laws and regulations. So for example, even at Woodburn, we offer payroll services where we will set up the social insurance accounts and housing fund accounts under your own company name, and we just facilitate the payments basically, and we facilitate the payment calculations. But your company is directly making the payments, okay? So you can still use a payroll agent to do all of that and then do the payments yourself, or do everything through the payroll agent like FESCO, which is what I assume Lily you're doing, is that FESCO is giving you basically a payment notice with a breakdown of every single employee, their social insurance amounts, gross salary, bonus, net salary, income tax, etc., and you just pay a lump sum. That's also another option for you. But as you are a limited company, nobody is forcing you to do anything. Okay, you can decide how you want to create your operational flow. And this is a very good point, because under the China roadmap, I talk about system processes. How do you want to create your operational guidelines? Okay, but as a limited company, you're not being forced to do anything. I'm going to leave it out there a little bit more. If anybody else wants to ask a question or just mention something, please do. More than happy to contribute. Lily, I hope I certainly answered your question. Seems like nothing else is coming in. So just to end off today's presentation, if you want to talk privately about these issues, book a strategy session. The link is in the chat box, and I'm more than happy to talk to you. Last but not least, I want to thank everyone who has joined all 4 sessions of this week for joining. It is great to have so many people participating on all 4 days. If you weren't able to make some of the days, the recordings, all recordings will actually be up on the YouTube channel by the end of today, hopefully, cross fingers. And I'll be sending out individual emails to all of you in any case with the information. We have an upcoming webinar series in March. It's already up on our website at woodburnglobal.com events about building your strategy for China. And I think this topic comes at really the right time, because with the coronavirus, I've been talking to so many companies who are so not sure about how they should be moving forward, whether they should put their company in China on a freeze button, meaning downsize and freeze everything because they're going through, or they predict severe business slumps, or companies that are looking to invest in China and are now rethinking, should China be a market for 2020? All I can say is come join us for building your strategy in China. I'm an optimist. On top of that, I experienced SARS, and all I can say to you is the following. You want to be prepared for the point in time that China recovers. You want to be ahead of your competitors, and you want to get things, you want to get the ball rolling. Everyone is going through a slight business slump right now because of the coronavirus. It's unfortunate. It's just the way it is right now. It will end at some point. My prediction is that by September, schools will be reopened, there'll be a new school year, and things will pick up once again. So you want to be ready for a September timeframe. So I just want to emphasize this webinar series. We're doing it at the end of the March. We're going to be looking at how to create your business strategy, how to create your sales strategy, what to think about. I'll be going into greater detail about the China Roadmap program and what you need to think about for each milestone, each task. And last but not least, how to actually execute your China strategy now, today, so that you can be ahead of the game once this virus dissipates. So again, interested in that, sign up for it, woodburnglobal.com/events to I want to thank everyone for joining me, for joining us this week, and I hope to see all of you again very soon. Take care and goodbye.